Myra Hindley and Ian Brady murder 5 Manchester children.
Doesn't bear thinking what's happened to these children at the hands of Brady and Hindley.
When the victims first disappear, their families come under suspicion.
They kept saying to me, "Did you have an argument with her? Did you hit her?" And I said, "No."
Despite most evidence being hidden or destroyed, detectives make a remarkable breakthrough.
I believe that the photographs that were contained in Brady's suitcase was the key to Pandora Box.
Once convicted, Myra Hindley is determined to get out of prison.
She formed a relationship with a female prison officer, and there was a rather bungled attempt at an escape.
She is desperate to win parole and twists the truth in a previously unseen letter to 10-year-old Lesley Ann Downey's parents.
She denied that Lesley was tortured, which was on the tape. If you don't stop it, I'll smack you again.
But Ian Brady takes revenge to ensure his former lover dies in prison.
Did you kill Keith Bennett? Pauline Reade?
The 5 child murders are followed by 5 decades of lies and manipulation, making Myra Hindley the most hated woman in Britain. It was the 7th of October, 1965. And 27-year-old Ian Brady had just been arrested as the main suspect in the murder of teenager Edward Evans. Brady's 23-year-old girlfriend, Myra Hindley, was also brought in for questioning. But only Myra and Ian knew they were responsible for far more murders than that of Edward Evans.
As far as the police were concerned, they had a murder. It was a murder, yes, but it was fairly routine. This wasn't yet the Moors murders. That was to unfold over the following weeks.
By the summer of 1965, the fear in Manchester had become palpable.
It all came together on TV, whereas they were saying that X number of children were missing from the same area.
Myra lived within a few miles of all her young victims, but no one suspected she had anything to do with the missing children. The first to disappear was 16-year-old Pauline Reade.
And Myra Hindley would go in the Bessemer pub, photographs of missing children on the wall, and she'd sit there and she'd have a drink with him, knowing that she knew where those children were.
12-year-old John Kilbride was next.
When he didn't come home, up neighbours were out searching, and here we got 9 o'clock, and that's when my mum rang the police, and the police came then.
Then 12-year-old Keith Bennett disappeared, followed by 10-year-old Lesley Ann Downey.
It was in December '64, Boxing Day, when Lesley Ann went missing off the fair.
But on the 6th of October, 1965, Myra Hindley and Ian Brady were about to make a pivotal mistake. That night, Glaswegian Ian targeted 17-year-old Edward Evans as their next unwitting victim.
If you play your cards right, you can come back to mine and my sister's for a wee drink.
The couple's mistake was to take Myra Hindley's brother-in-law, David Smith, into their confidence.
You wait here.
17-year-old David had no idea he'd been invited to witness a diabolical murder that he would later describe to his widow, Mary.
He saw Ian Brady repeatedly hitting him with an axe, and Dave recalls very, very vividly him screaming for his mother.
At first light the next morning, Myra and Ian's world was about to be blown apart. David reported the crime to the police.
Hello, police? Could you send a car?
He was brought in for questioning.
Just take a seat round there.
David Smith believed he was likely to be the killer couple's next victim, so wanted to cooperate with the police.
Go on.
But when Ian Brady was questioned, he claimed Edward Evans' death was not premeditated.
We had a row. Came to full blows, the situation got out of control.
He also insisted David Smith had helped to kill Evans, but that Myra Hindley had no part in the crime.
Then we tied up the body, Dave and I. Nobody else helped.
But David had some crucial information for the investigation team, because Ian Brady had revealed to him that he had killed before.
You think I'm lying, don't you, Dave?
Brady, in his drunken nights, had said, "I've committed a murder. I've done murders before."
And they'll be done again.
David told the police that there were likely to be more victims. But the 17-year-old had a criminal record for actual bodily harm. So detectives were reluctant to believe him.
Let's just get back to what happened at the house that night.
They had every reason to disbelieve him. This, after all, was somebody who had a string of violent convictions. This was not somebody to be trusted.
Myra and Ian were desperate to discredit David, because they knew his testimony could bring about their downfall.
I know David Smith's told you all this, and he's a liar. He's a liar.
The police had also discovered a blood-stained walking stick at the scene of the crime. It belonged to David Smith.
Forensics showed that there were fragments of skin and skull on that stick. Could be that Ian Brady had used the stick after using the axe. It could be that Myra Hindley used it. Nobody knows.
But the police were about to discover David was telling the truth. When an officer searched Myra Hindley's car, they found breakthrough evidence. And another crucial clue was found jotted in one of Ian Brady's notebooks, which would transform the murder inquiry. On the 7th of October, 1965, Ian Brady was being questioned about the murder of Manchester teenager Edward Evans. Ian claimed he had not planned to kill Edward Evans, but when detectives searched Myra Hindley's car, they discovered evidence he was lying. A wallet belonging to Ian Brady contained a sheet of paper with written notes in code which laid out plans to dispose of the body. Ian Fairley was part of the original police investigation team. Back then, he was a young 21-year-old detective constable.
We find a disposal plan. Send body, take it to Mars and bury the body, you know.
The police believe the only reason Ian failed to carry out his plan to cover up the murder by hiding the body was because he suffered an ankle injury during the attack.
If he hadn't been injured, that body would have been in the car and have been taken up the moors.
24 hours after his arrest, the police had enough evidence to charge Ian Brady, but only for the murder of Edward Evans. David Smith was allowed to leave, but was told he would need to return for further questioning about the other possible victims. A lack of evidence against her meant Myra Hindley could not be charged and was allowed to go. The first thing she did was head to the office where she worked with Ian Brady to dispose of further evidence, making the job of the police extremely difficult.
There's nothing incriminating in the house at all. We try and we search the works. Nothing incriminating in the works.
Detectives were finding it hard to stand up David Smith's theory that Ian Brady had killed before. But then they found the smallest of clues, a name jotted on the page of a notebook belonging to Ian. It was the name of a 12-year-old child who'd been missing for 2 years.
I've got two gangster drawings, if you like, but on the other side, we've got John Kilbride's name. John Kilbride was a young lad who was missing from Sunderline, about 4 miles away.
Before the arrest of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, Kilbride's own father came under suspicion for abusing his children and killing John. John's brother, Terry, recalls the devastating impact on the family.
People's making sure we'd not been touched when they thought it was my dad. We'd been through all that. We'd been through reporters day in and day out and day in and day out. We'd been through watching my mum and my dad deteriorate like they did.
In reality, the 12-year-old Ashton schoolboy was Myra and Ian's second victim. Years later, in her unpublished autobiography, Myra Hindley claimed she only stood guard whilst Ian Brady sexually assaulted and killed John Kilbride on Saddleworth Moor. She would try to distance herself in this way from all the murders. When Ian Brady was first interviewed about the 12-year-old's sudden disappearance,
Do you know the name John Kilbride?
he denied any involvement.
I think I may have heard about it.
Brady's reaction when he was questioned about that was just blasé. Well, so what? There's a name there. Nothing to do with me. Well, it's my writing. I may have written down. But he said, who's John Kilbride?
The police did not have enough evidence to charge Ian Brady with John Kilbride's murder, but they were now convinced by David Smith's side of the story, so charged Myra as an accomplice in the murder of Edward Evans. A police forensics team would find traces of the teenager's blood on her shoes soon afterwards. The now iconic police mugshot taken at the time would haunt Myra for the rest of her life.
On the day she was defiant. She was there as a brassy blonde, hard.
The police now believed David Smith when he said both Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were involved in more murders, so began to question the couple about other missing children.
And what about Keith Bennett?
Again, Ian gave nothing away. In fact, he knew full well what had happened to Keith 16 months earlier.
He was led onto the moor a very long distance, far further than the other victims, and he was then raped and killed as the others had been.
David Smith told police about trips with Ian Brady to Saddleworth Moor, and that Ian made boasts about hiding the bodies of his victims there.
You've even sat on the grave.
He just came out with it. I didn't know what to do. I didn't believe him.
But Saddleworth Moor was vast, and the only police evidence linking Ian Brady to the area were dozens of photographs in an album found in the house he shared with Myra Hindley. These photographs would eventually provide breakthrough evidence, but at this time, the police thought they were simply typical family snapshots.
It looked like an innocuous photograph album, but secreted amongst this were pictures that were marker pictures. It was part of a system that had been used to record where all the victims were buried.
But for now, the police didn't understand the significance of the photographs. So desperate to find more hard evidence, they asked David Smith about other crimes Ian Brady had been planning before the murder of Edward Evans.
We interviewed him in the car park off Hattersley Court Flats.
So what else did you get to?
He said when we were talking about doing a bank job, I had to take everything to Brady that might incriminate me in anything at all that was possibly a criminal action. What did he do with them? He said he put them in the suitcase. Suitcase?
David Smith told officers that he helped carry the 2 suitcases out of Ian's house. Whilst David didn't know where the cases were taken, he knew Ian would often hang out at local railway stations. So detectives decided to call all of the left luggage offices in the region.
Piccadilly and Central. Yeah, I'll hold.
We didn't know what station they were in. The only thing we could tell them that they'd been deposited there before the 7th of October.
All right, thank you.
The move paid off. The team tracked down the suitcases to Manchester's Central Station. They then found the left luggage ticket hidden in the spine of a prayer book belonging to Myra Hindley. This linked the couple to the suitcases, but much more evidence was about to be found.
Let's get to it.
Little did they realise what horrors lay inside. Ten-year-old Lesley Ann Downey had disappeared from her home in Ancoats in Manchester 10 months earlier. But at the time, it was her stepfather Alan who came under police suspicion.
They kept saying to me, what have you done with her? The copper said to me, he said, what's in there? I said, just bedding and linen and what have you. He said, it's big enough to put a body. I said, there's no bodies in there, mate. So with temper, I opened the cupboard doors and I threw everything out on the floor. I said, you're satisfied now? He said, yeah.
But once the police opened the 2 suitcases, they found out Myra and Ian were responsible for the disappearance of Lesley Ann Downey.
I found a photograph of a little girl who had a scarf round about her face, and she was naked.
Along with the photographs, detectives discovered 2 reels of audio tape.
There's an audio reel there, which in itself in 1965 was unusual.
Both Myra and Ian's voices could be heard on the tape, shouting at, torturing and sexually abusing the young girl. Both suspects were confronted with the new evidence.
I believe the voices on that tape recording are yours, Brady's, and Lesley Ann Downey's.
I'm talking to you now, I'm now 70 years of age. That's 48 years ago. It still makes the hairs on the back of my neck start to stand up when I think what actually is on that tape. There they are, torturing a little girl, and at the same time playing music in the background, and Myra Hindley's telling her to shut up, and they're obviously taking photographs of her.
When officers played the tape to Myra Hindley, she began to sob.
I think she realised that it was almost the final nail in her coffin. Because there was no jury ever going to find her not guilty when her voice was on that tape.
Myra Hindley wrote to me in great detail about all of the murders bar the killing of Lesley Ann Downey. And the reason she wasn't able to deal with this, she said to me, was because she was such a cruel, cruel bastard.
The tape-recorded evidence firmly placed Myra alongside Ian at the scene of the abuse and murder. Whereas with all the other murders, she repeatedly claimed, in great detail, not to have been present. But at the time of the interrogation, neither Myra Hindley nor Ian Brady would confirm the identity of the girl on the tape.
Saying nothing.
Myra and Ian's denials meant the police were forced to ask Lesley Ann Downey's parents to listen to the recording.
With the Hindley shouting at her about, stop crying. If you don't stop, I'll smack you again. And that made it worse. She cried all the more. She said, I want to go home to me mummy.
Lesley Ann's mother, Ann West, has now died, but the tape haunts her stepfather, Alan, to this very day.
That is my nightmare. Like, even though I'm sitting here talking to you now, it's going right the way through me. So you can imagine what it's like when you're in bed, laying there. You've got nothing to think about other than what has happened. And I've got that 24 hours a day.
All evidence pointed to Lesley Ann Downey's body being buried on Saddleworth Moor. There were likely to be other bodies there too, but the task facing a 1960s police force in finding them would be huge.
They trench searches for miles and miles and miles of barren landscape. But they'd searched practically every area without success.
As well as finding the incriminating evidence of Lesley Ann Downey's murder in the suitcases, detectives also found more photographs of Saddleworth Moor, which made them realise the pictures must be significant.
They looked at all the photographs that we had in the Tartan album, took their own photographs of outlines, and were able to compare them with some of the outlines that was in the photographs in the suitcases.
It's this one.
Police identified one of the areas as Holland Brown Knoll and started concentrating their searches there. But time wore on, and still they found nothing. The detectives were about to call off the search for another day, when a policeman shouted out,
Something up here!
A constable called Bob Spears, what he saw was a fragment of something white sticking out of the black moorland peat.
The team uncovered the remains of a young girl. The parents of Lesley Ann Downey were asked to identify the body.
As you walked in the corner was Leslie's clothing all folded up. Then we went into another room, and it showed you like to the table, and they pulled the cloth back, the sheet back. You can see her now. Terrible.
Having found the body of Lesley Ann Downey, that gave us an indication that that was an area, obviously, where they, Brady and Hindley, were interested in, and that condensed our area of immediate interest.
Detectives now knew that the photographs taken by Myra and Ian were the key to cracking the case. But limited resources meant the investigation team faced a race against time to track down the 3 missing children.
I believe that the photographs that were contained in Brady's suitcase was the key.
One photograph in particular, featuring Myra Hindley on the moors holding her dog, became the focus of intense police attention. But would this snapshot lead detectives to another of the couple's victims? Detectives investigating the child serial killers Myra Hindley and Ian Brady had so far uncovered evidence linking them to the murders of Edward Evans and now Lesley Ann Downey. But officers suspected there could be more victims.
They had photographs of the moorland. They didn't know exactly what these pictures were, but they had an idea that they could be connected to where the bodies were buried.
There was one photograph of particular interest to the police. Myra Hindley holding her dog, taken at a spot close to where Lesley Ann Downey's body had been found.
You think she's looking at the dog. Well, when you look at it closely, she is not looking at the dog. She is looking at the ground beyond the dog.
By matching the pattern of rocks, detectives found the exact location where Myra had been crouching. They then dug in the spot where Myra's gaze was fixed in the photograph and discovered the body of 12-year-old John Kilbride, along with a single shoe. Ian Bennett was a reporter at the time for the Oldham Chronicle and watched the police carry out their investigation.
The search area was enormous. It stretched best part of 2 miles along the road and several hundred yards into the moors. So it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. A policeman found Lesley Ann's body by the rocks that you can see on the skyline. The second body, John Kilbride, was found on the other side of the road.
The recovery of John's body evoked mixed emotions for his mother, Sheila.
Yes, it was anguish, because all the time I felt that I wasn't going to hear anything at all. I thought his body must have been burned and I would never know all my life. I'm very glad that, in a way, relieved that we do know where he is now.
John Kilbride's body was too badly decomposed for the police to ask his family to identify, so they took the one shoe Ian Brady had left in his makeshift grave to the 12-year-old's home.
I remember him coming to the house, it was about 8:30 at night. The knock came on the door, and it was John's shoe.
There were 2 remaining missing children still unaccounted for, Pauline Reade and Keith Bennett. Some speculated 16-year-old Pauline had run away with a secret boyfriend, but her family knew this would not have happened.
Pauline loved her mum and loved her father and brother so much that she would have got in touch with them one way or another. But then when we'd found out about the murders in Attersley and we found out Myra Hindley and Ian Brady had done it, we knew where Pauline was. We knew she was on the moors.
But the couple refused to confirm there had been any other victims, and detectives had no concrete evidence linking them to the disappearance of Pauline Reade and Keith Bennett.
Yes, sir, I appreciate that.
Spiralling costs led to pressure to wrap up the investigation. And in the end, it was decided to only charge the child serial killers with the murders of Edward Evans, John Kilbride, and Lesley Ann Downey, much to the disappointment of the 2 missing children's families and investigating officers.
We felt totally frustrated. We didn't feel the job had been done.
Myra and Ian were allowed to have the same solicitor, and whilst awaiting trial, met together to receive case briefings.
In terms of the dates of the trial, these are what we're looking at.
They used the opportunity to exchange coded messages.
These coded messages weren't only about their love and their relationship, They were also about enjoying the murders they'd committed.
They wrote sick fantasies to each other about injuring children.
One of them was, why don't you throw acid on Brett? Brett was Lesley Ann Downey's brother. So here they were, after their arrest for the Moors murders, awaiting trial, exchanging secret messages about harming children.
News of the killer couple's reign of terror had spread across the world by the time their trial began on the 19th of April, 1966, at Chester Crown Court.
All rise. Ian Brady regarded the courtroom as something that he could almost preside over. His overconfidence and narcissism actually made him think that everyone would believe what he said.
Myra's defense would see her claim she had been bullied into abducting the children by Ian, and that she had not carried out any of the murders. It was a story she would stick to until the day she died, and it was one she hoped would get her out of prison early.
For him, he always said that he was going to die in prison. He had no wish to come out, he was quite happy being there. Whereas Hindley was the exact opposite. She wanted out. And I think the pact was that if she kept denying it, she could convince people that she was innocent. Better chance of getting out.
But during the trial, Ian Brady made a crucial error. Having tried to help Myra by portraying her as innocent and passive, he was asked what happened after he completed taking pornographic photographs of 10-year-old Lesley Ann Downey.
So what happened next, Mr. Brady?
After completion, we all got dressed and went downstairs.
In summing up, the judge said that Ian's words possibly casts a flood of light on the nature of the activities that were going on. Along with the tape, Ian Brady's mistake also placed Myra Hindley firmly at the murder scene and exposed her true role. On the 6th of May, 1966, the Moors murderers were sentenced. Ian Brady was given 3 concurrent life sentences for the murders of Edward Evans, John Kilbride, and Lesley Ann Downey. As well as being found guilty as an accessory in the murder of John Kilbride, Myra Hindley would receive 2 concurrent life sentences for the murders of Edward Evans and Lesley Ann Downey. She was 23 years old. Once the couple were convicted and sent to prison for life, the families of Pauline Reade and Keith Bennett hoped they would have the compassion to reveal where the bodies of their missing children were buried. Pauline's family were particularly hopeful, as she had been Myra's sister's best friend.
One of Myra Hindley's aunties went to the prison and begged her to say where Pauline was, and she still didn't.
The families of Pauline Reade and Keith Bennett were left in limbo, and the reason was that a calculation was taken. The police had done their job, and indeed they had done their job, but what they hadn't done was to deliver true justice to the families of all the disappeared children.
For the first few years of their prison sentences, Myra and Ian continued to exchange letters full of sick fantasies. Myra, now known as prisoner 964055, transformed her iconic hairstyle from platinum blonde to jet black. But despite changing her appearance, Myra Hindley was a target for fellow inmates.
Myra Hindley was a high-profile prisoner. She was the most hated woman in the country. So it was inevitable that people who wanted to make a name for themselves would attack her. She knew that this was coming, and she simply took it in her stride. She was a tough person, and she was able to deal with that sort of thing.
But not everyone in Holloway Prison hated Myra. 4 years into serving her sentence, she began a relationship with a former nun-turned-prison officer, Trish Cairns.
When she saw Patricia Cairns, she fell immediately in love with her, the way she'd fallen in love with Ian Brady.
Interestingly, Brady says to Hindley, I think it's about time you got yourself a girlfriend. And she writes back and says, don't worry, I already have. So the relationship was clearly becoming acrimonious.
Soon afterwards, Myra Hindley cut her ties with Ian Brady, burning all of his letters. Ian felt betrayed. and in time would plot his revenge. Meanwhile, Myra became frustrated by her limited time with Trish and decided she wanted out of jail.
Want to escape? Yeah, so do I. No, I mean it.
Myra was serious. The first step of her plan saw Trish Cairns and an accomplice create a mould of the prison keys. A package containing the mould and an escape plan was sent to the forger, but the address he'd given wasn't his own home, but that of a London garage. In an era of IRA letter bombs, the garage owner was suspicious and showed it to a customer.
What do you think?
Who happened to be an undercover police officer.
When it arrived, it was a package, so he thought it might be a letter bomb. There was a police officer there, and hey presto, it's a mould of the keys to Holloway Prison. Trisha was convicted and had a very hard 6 years in prison.
Myra and Trisha were now in different prisons, and their relationship eventually petered out. In the 1980s, an aging Myra Hindley decided to have another crack at freedom, this time by applying for parole.
She mounted a prolonged legal campaign. She wrote over 150 pages of letters to me to try and put forward the argument that she was bullied into the killings by Ian Brady, that she was a reluctant participant.
Establishment figures such as former Cabinet Minister Lord Longford campaigned passionately to get Myra Hindley out of prison.
Myra Hindley was a highly manipulative woman. She was able to shape her story with great skill to try and maximise her chances of release. And the way she did this was quite extraordinary. So she was able to get people to support her that no ordinary prisoner would ever have been able to bring onto her side.
Lord Longford even went as far as to describe Myra as being a good girl and a devout Catholic, much to the anger of the murdered children's relatives.
All those supporters she had, to be honest, there was barm cakes. She was using them. They knew that, but they couldn't see through it.
Alan and his wife campaigned hard to keep Myra Hindley in prison.
She thought she would get the parole. The decision we made was that we would get as many signatures as possible down to Downing Street when Maggie Thatcher was in. Just handed them in, a couple of boxes of them. I think it was about 170,000.
In May 1985, the Parole Board recommended Myra Hindley spend at least 5 more years behind bars.
What she should have realised, somebody can't be considered for parole unless they've admitted the guilt in a thing like murder. She was denying it. She was never going to get out, I hoped.
If Myra Hindley had the moral insight into the degree of suffering that her crimes caused both victims and their families, she would never have made any attempts to gain freedom from prison.
Meanwhile, Ian Brady's mental health had seriously deteriorated, and he was transferred to Ashworth High Security Prison. Myra Hindley was particularly worried, knowing her chances of getting out of prison depended on him staying silent.
It was only a matter of time before Ian Brady, in order to keep Myra Hindley inside, would let on that there were another 2 bodies.
In June 1985, Ian Brady decided to finally exact his revenge on Myra Hindley for what he saw as her betrayal for cutting him out of her life.
Hello, Ian. Fred.
Brady agreed to a face-to-face meeting with journalist Fred Harrison. He was looking for a scoop and got access to him in prison by pretending to be a friend.
Did you kill them? Did you kill Keith Bennett? Pauline Reade?
He gave Fred Harrison enough information to print the story that was correct about Keith Bennett and Pauline Reade being victims of the Moors murders, but on the other hand, he fed him a pack of lies as well. This is characteristic of Brady, wanting to be in control, to be in charge, superior, above everybody.
Ian Brady managed to ensure that Myra Hindley was not going to be even considered for parole.
After Ian Brady admitted to killing Pauline Reade and Keith Bennett, Greater Manchester Police reopened the Moors murder inquiry. When questioned, Myra Hindley finally admitted to her role in the abduction, abuse and murder of all 5 children. But a never-before-seen letter written by the serial killer just 7 months after her confession reveals her real focus remained to get herself out of prison. (1986), and the police had relaunched the hunt for the bodies of Pauline Reade and Keith Bennett. Myra Hindley recognized that if she played a part in finding the missing children, it could be a way of gaining her freedom.
You ready?
She agreed to go back to the scene of her crimes, Saddleworth Moor, in a bid to help the police finally trace the buried bodies. The trip was shrouded in secrecy. Fearing Myra's visit would not only attract the press, but vigilantes out for revenge, the police took precautions to hide her identity.
It had to be done with the permission of the Home Secretary. We took her onto the moor on a route that we chose rather than one that she chose.
But Myra was confused by the different approach to the moors.
A grave mistake on our part, but partly due to the security conditions imposed upon us. We had to make sure that she was secure and safe the whole time and was not viewed or photographed. And with hindsight, that was an absolute disaster.
The search for the missing bodies came to nothing. But was Myra Hindley's willingness to help simply a cynical ploy to gain her freedom?
This, she saw, would put her in a shining light in the public's eye and in the parole board's eye. She actually said her entire exercise on the moor was driven by one of Winnie Johnson's letters appealing to her for the body of Keith Bennett, whereas in fact, of course, Winnie Johnson had written to her many, many times hoping for this, and Myra Hindley had quite simply ignored it.
Myra would revisit the moors, this time approaching via the lay-by she remembered. Again, it would prove to be fruitless. But a routine phone call in prison provided a breakthrough in the search for the missing bodies.
The thought crossed our mind that it was important whether it was daylight or dusk when the murder and burial had taken place. We asked her this very question, and she said it was dusk. I remember that because I looked across the valley and I could see the outline of the peaks on the other side of the valley. We went back the following day and found there was only one area where you could actually see these peaks. It was a fantastic piece of luck.
On July the 1st, 1987, 24 years after her murder,
What?
the police finally found the body of Pauline Reade.
When we found out, it was sadness, but joy, really, because we could put her to rest.
The only body left to be found on the moors was that of 12-year-old Keith Bennett.
The moment in Brady heard that we'd found Pauline Reade's body, he said that he wanted to come to Saddleworth Moor.
Is that here?
At times, Ian Brady looked like he knew where he was.
I need to get there.
But other times, Ian would appear confused.
At one stage, came out with a remarkable response of something to the effect of who's moved that hill.
The police continued to search areas pointed out by Myra and Ian for 8 weeks after the discovery of Pauline's body.
We've exhausted every possible gully, and eventually we put a file up to the Attorney General for a decision on whether or not they should be prosecuted for the 2 additional murders. Our advice was that this wouldn't have any practical effect and would be a media scrum.
The decision was made not to prosecute and to call off the police search for Keith Bennett. The 12-year-old's body remains missing to this day.
They were left to dig for Keith on their own. Winnie and members of the family spent years looking for his remains, and they were left out on a limb. And there was an enduring sense of anger from Winnie Johnson about this until the day that she died.
Meanwhile, Myra Hindley would continue to do whatever she could to win parole, including writing to the families of her victims. This never-before-seen letter was sent to the parents of Lesley Ann Downey. In it, Myra states their 10-year-old daughter was not tortured.
We got an 8-page letter from her. She denied that Lesley was tortured, which was on the tape. If you don't stop it, I'll smack you again. We heard it. So why could she deny it?
Myra Hindley's purpose in writing this letter was clearly one of manipulation and trying to confront the reality of the torture of Lesley Ann Downey and trying to assert that it actually never happened. The whole purpose of this is to actually prevent the West's campaign, which is undermining Myra's attempts at getting parole.
Never wrote back to Hindley after receiving this letter because it's told us everything we want to know anyway. That she's just a liar. A big liar.
Time would show Alan West was right to be sceptical about Myra Hindley's motivation for writing the letter.
Within the letter, Myra Hindley states quite categorically that she expects to die in prison, that she's giving up the whole idea of parole. And yet, following the letter, in a very short period of time, she's made another appeal for parole.
But ultimately, Myra's numerous bids for freedom would end in failure. 37 years after this picture was taken, a photo which would become an emblem of evil across the world, Myra Hindley died due to complications arising from a chest infection.
I was pleased as punch. Yeah. Wanted to go to the funeral to kick up a right hell. But obviously with the amount of police at the crematorium, you couldn't get anywhere near it.
I had a phone call, actually. I was in Spain, in a place called Muddied in Benidorm. And I went over to the girl on the stage. I said, "Will you do me a favour, please?" She said, "What?" I said, "Will you tell everybody in here that Myra Hindley is dead?" And she did. And everybody started to clap in the place.
Ian Brady has been on hunger strike since 1999, although witnesses claim he secretly eats every day. In June 2013, he attended a mental health tribunal, asking to be transferred to a normal jail because he no longer wants to be force-fed. His rambling testimony during the hearing revealed he still has no remorse. He described abducting, torturing and killing the 5 children as recreational. Ian Brady continues to claim he doesn't know the whereabouts of Keith Bennett's remains.
Keith Bennett's unfound body is very important to Ian Brady. He has one actual murder which he can consider to be perfect.
Ian Brady's request to be transferred to an ordinary prison was rejected. Meanwhile, Keith Bennett's family have launched a petition for the police to resume the search for his body. His brother Alan remains adamant.
The case can never be closed until Keith is found. All of the other victims have been given proper funerals. We are just desperate to be able to do the same for Keith and finally lay him to rest.
Myra Hindley has been dead for more than a decade, but for her role in the murder of 5 children, including Keith Bennett, she remains the most hated woman in living memory.
She was evil. She was just as evil as him. In fact, she was worse than Ian Brady, because she was a woman.
I still hate him, even though she's dead. I still hate her now. She's in purgatory, she's just flying around. She doesn't know where to land, she's got nowhere to go. And that's what I want. I want him to do the same.